Welcome to this third offering in our CISA webinar series entitled Facing the Future with Psychology, Perspectives, Praxis and People. I'm Floretta Bonzaya. I'm the president-elect for CISA and the chair of the session today. And in today's webinar, we turn our attention to gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa, asking provocative questions and thinking about the possibilities for unsettling such violence. The COVID pandemic has provided another moment in media, popular and scholarly discourse to make visible the extent, persistence, and the consequences of gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. Reports from across the globe have suggested that with increased pandemic lockdown restrictions from March 2020, there were associated increase in reports of domestic violence. In South Africa, reports of domestic violence related calls to the South African Police Service. There was an increase in domestic violence calls to the South African police. At the same time, in 2020, Statistics South Africa reported that there were almost 35,000 teenage mothers under the age of 17 or younger. These statistics relating to the peak of the COVID pandemic, when many children were not attending school, highlights the vulnerability of young girls to sexual exploitation and abuse. So researchers have argued that the nature of the measures used to prevent infections such as isolation and lockdown, and the anxiety and uncertainty associated with COVID provided an enabling environment that potentially increase the use of violence, especially in the home. It has also been argued that lockdowns give perpetrators more freedom and limit women's possibilities for movement and their access to regular sources of social support, as well as health and other support services, all resources that are already out of reach sometimes for many marginalized persons in grossly unequal societies such as South Africa. The relationship between the COVID and GBV pandemics were also evident in media discourse, allowing for a renewed and perhaps a sustained attention to the problem of GBV and femicide. Analysis on media discourse, however, illustrated that this renewed attention to GBV in media discourse wasn't necessarily helpful or progressive, in that it not only continued to provide contextual, degendered readings of the violence that obscures patriarchy, misogyny, and sexual entitlement, but also this media discourse sometimes relied on racialized tropes that are part of a longer historical colonial narrative about the lives and identities of Black people. Work has also illustrated that oftentimes the political response in media in particular, the public political response to GBV and femicide relies heavily on militarized masculine tropes. And this does very little to unsettle normative ideas and representations around gender. While most recent statistics indicate a decline in the rate of femicide between 1999 and 2017, we know that GBV and femicide continues to be an ongoing problem for South African women, gender and sexual diverse and non-conforming persons, limiting our freedoms and the true attainment of gender equity. The Medical Research Council recently released a report on their most recent femicide study up to 2017 and considers the rate of femicide, femicide being the killing of a female person regardless of the person's age, gender identity, or sexual orientation. They looked at 3 time periods, 1999, 2009, and 2017. And the research shows that over these 3 time periods, we see a decline in the rates of femicide, both intimate partner femicide and non-intimate partner femicide. And they argue, the researchers from the MRC, that we are beginning to reap the benefits of the work of activists, community-based and other organizations, government policy and practice. But there are a number of areas of concern that emerge from this work that obviously tell us we can't be complacent, barring the fact that we also still don't know what the result of the COVID pandemic has been on the rates of femicide. That's the researchers are currently in the field for the 20 I think, 2021 femicide study. The issues of concern that emerged from the research on femicide by the MRC include the fact that there's been a diminishing quality of police investigations, with too little documentation of prior histories of previous partner violence in the cases of femicide. The work shows that women with protection orders are also still being killed by their partners, and that we need to pay greater attention to firearm control. And this has been illustrated by the recent mass shootings that have been prevalent in our country. Overall, 2,407 women were murdered in South Africa in 2017. That is almost 7 women per day, and these are, of course, too many women dying. GBV has and continues to be framed from a hegemonic cisgender and heteronormative perspective that continues to exclude the LGBTQIA+ community. And we need to find ways to subvert this focus. We can do so by privileging the narratives of gendered violence from the viewpoint of non-normative groups and those whose voices have been rendered invisible even in feminist practice. We can consider, for example, how some recent research has shed light on the experiences of violence of transgender women, Black transgender women, and this violence was represented as institutional, structural, and interpersonal, located in a context in which society is structured along a repressive gender binary system. Women in the research by Shabalala and colleagues reported hypersurveillance, hyperscrutiny, and their stories revealed being policed and harshly punished for their social rejection of gender norms. The violence included symbolic forms of violence, such as exclusion from learning or in learning and medical institutions, gendered modes of street harassment, workplace bullying, and other mechanisms of interpersonal structural violence. Women in the study were also subjected to sexual violence such as harassment, assault, and rape, with the sexual violence being used as a weapon to control and discipline their transgression of gender norms. Black transgender women's experiences of violence are unambiguously structural. The interpersonal is also observed to be mediated by structural ideological forces of cis-sexism, heteropatriarchy, and gender normativity. What the experiences of Black, transgender, and other women shows is that GBV is a structural phenomenon rooted in patriarchal norms and ideas of the gender binary that systematically values men over women, masculinity over femininity, heterosexuality over homosexuality, and cisgender people over transgender people. Women globally, but specifically on the continent, also feel the brunt of economic and political forces that include predatory and exploitative capitalism, seen in the feminization of poverty, women's low status in society, restrictive social and cultural positions, as well as the effects of patriarchal violence that is embedded in judicial and policing systems. We know structural violence places women at increased risk of IPV, intimate partner violence, for example, but also limits their possibilities of living free from violence. Research has indicated that not only does poverty complicate a woman's experiences of violence from an intimate partner, but being poor represents a significant risk factor for violence. We know often also that physical violence is prioritized over structural forms of violence, which exacerbate GBV outcomes. We should therefore understand the interconnectedness of the different forms of violence that are experienced by women and gender non-conforming persons, and that might provide more effective responses to the racialized, gendered, and class foundations of GBV. A focus on physical violence rather than structural forms prioritize responding to GBV over prevention and renders invisible forms of non-physical violence, such as sexist, cis-sexist, and misogynistic views, as well as the effects of sexual and gendered violence on minority groups. So in this current, possibly, but not quite post-pandemic context moment, we turn renewed attention to the question of gendered violence and femicide. And we ask, what are the everyday knowledges and practices that we need to refuse and unsettle towards provoking change towards freedom? What are the possibilities for building a nonviolent future. And we've asked each of the speakers to direct their attention to these questions from the perspective of their current work and their engagements with work around GBV and femicide. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Savuka Machila. Savuka Machila is a gender non-conforming human rights activist born in Datsane, Eastern Cape, with over a decade's experience working with civil society organizations. Savuka's work targets legal, clinical, educational, and community-based fronts through both local and international spheres. A degree in sociology and philosophy, and gender, religion, and health, and honors studies inspire Savuka to seek out possibilities of community consciousness that affect the overall psychosocial and economic livelihood of LGBTIQ+ people and their families. Savuka hopes to progress the championing of efforts that secure the further realization of dignity and well-being inherent for everyone within the world of gender and sexual diversity. Thank you. Over to Savuka.
Thank you, Floretta, and good evening to everyone on the call today. Thank you for joining us for this quite important conversation, very necessary as we end the month of July into the month of August, which is Women's Month, to give awareness and shed light to the issue of gender-based violence. If I may share my screen so that I can share my presentation with you. Much appreciated, I think, to Floretta for giving us a quite a nice summary there in terms of how gender-based violence is currently represented in society and how marginalized groups like trans and gender-diverse people bear the brunt of gender-based violence as it stands. And as I work at Gender Dynamics as a health advocacy officer, we are in a space where we advocate for transgender diverse people in society to have that space to access rights, to realize their rights and their identities within the society's structures of law and community engagements. And so this is quite a critical space for us to find ways in which we can speak to the ideals of gender and perhaps ways in which we can dismantle how limited those views are currently and detrimental, I guess, to a whole lot of identities that are influenced. Let me try and see. There we go. So as I said, my name is Savuka. Thank you for the introductions there. My pronouns are they and them. I'm gender non-conforming, and I'm the health advocacy officer at Gender Dynamics. So we have to get an understanding first of what we mean by gender-based violence. And some of the definitions here offered would allude to it being the harmful acts directed at an individual based on their gender. These acts are rooted in gender equality and kind of center the abuse of power and harmful norms. Gender-based violence also refers to any harm inflicted against a person's will, which result in discrimination and unequal power on the basis of gender roles and norms. These can affect people of all genders and used to establish and reinforce gender inequalities. Gender-based violence disproportionately affects women and girls. Violence against women was originally the standpoint in which we kind of understand the dynamics between the violence between genders, which was perpetrated by men originally against women, which gave rise to the issues that also flag violence against LGBTI people and against other men. And so the conversation in the feminist pool was that in order to centralize gender-based violence against women as quite the phenomenon that needs to be dissected and attended to, if we group this gender-based violence into kind of an umbrella term, we run the risk of minimalizing the impact that the disproportional issues affect women in terms of gender dynamics. And so felt that we need to have a spotlight shown upon the idea that women are the sole victims, or majority of the victims when it comes to gender-based violence. But the term itself seeks to then perhaps problematize patriarchy and the power dynamics against other genders, in which patriarchy is solely responsible. And so we trouble the idea of power when we talk about gender-based violence, that indeed we speak to the power dynamics which genders perhaps feel in terms of their identity, inherent identity that they hold against other genders. This could be men against women. This could be men against boys. This could be women against girls. Men versus older people, and men or general population against the transgender and gender diverse population. So power is at the root of gender-based violence, and how these genders assert their identities through these power dynamics. So quick stats here. We have a report according to the police in 2021-2022, that revealed that 903 women were murdered between October and December of 2021, sorry for that stat, and there were 11,315 rapes. And of course, we speak about reported stats, and we can see these numbers are growing each year. But we really can be sure that a lot of these stats aren't reported because of the system that we have, because of institutional breakdowns, limitations with access, etc., as well as how other processes within violence and people who experience violences that induce suicide, trauma, post-traumatic trauma, that lead to various breakdowns that aren't reported as direct links to violence. And so violence in itself is quite the iceberg effect, where we see very small trickles being reported, but the real effect, the most powerful, strong effect, is still quite underrepresented. And in 2014, there's a small study done where we saw that 86% of trans people have experienced some sort of violence in their lives. And as gender dynamics, we seek to find ways in which we can elevate the voices of trans and gender-diverse people as underrepresented and misrepresented people in society, to highlight the fact that they're disproportionately marginalized economically, physically, socially, and other forms as well. And so bear the brunt in a lot of ways as marginalized individuals within the reported stats of women as people who are also quite affected by gender-based violence. So gender-based violence itself, one might think it is an odd stray man affecting a stranger, you know, a woman maybe in the streets that never met, but the stats that seem to allude that violence in itself is perpetrated by those who are close to you than those who are strangers. And so according to the stats, there's nearly 50% of gender-based assaults are committed by someone close, like a friend or an acquaintance, or spouse or an intimate partner, which is 15% for the latter and 22% for the former, or relative or household member, which is 13%. And only 29% of those deaths are committed by a complete stranger. And so we find that interpersonal violence and intimate partner violence are much more prone to induce gender-based violence as opposed to non-partner violence. And this happens within trans and gender spaces, where the ways in which we understand power within relationships, we find that the perhaps more masculine, in order to assert certain ways of masculinity, would be prone to be more perpetrator in terms of gender-based violence. And you also find that economically, perhaps the one with more resources would be in that position as well. But we have quite a few ways in which gender-based violence can be understood or perpetrated through physical violence, harmful traditional practices, economical violence, physical, psychological violence, and sexual violence. These are some of the definitions. I won't go through all of them in light of time, but we have an idea that these forms, particular economic violence and psychological violence, happen and affect people strongly as well, in ways in which they can understand themselves, navigate these spaces, and also engage in the kind of the social settings, particularly these particular partners, and have resulting effects, traumatic resulting effects on a person's psychology, a person's ways, access and ability to navigate their spaces. We also find harmful traditional practices which are perpetuated by culture, traditional culture, as generational ways of thinking and viewing the world, of understanding identity, which are perpetuated without necessarily being scrutinized and to kind of understand the effects they have on the modern person. And so these are some of the ways in which we can experience gender-based violence within the ambits of power in relationships. And so I'd like to just center perhaps my presentation on how in most of the stats that we've engaged with in the past within media, in the conversations, we find that men are seen as the perpetrators of violence. And this is so. We can see this in ways in which the prisons are dominated by men perpetrating violence and other forms of crimes, and in which, in terms of the courts and in terms of the ways in which survivors speak out, that men will be the aggressors in this case. And so we look into how the modeling of men might influence or inform the ways in which they express the gender in relation to other genders. And we zoom in to the idea of heteronormativity and cisnormativity as some of the strong core values and basis of which men navigate from, that seem to privilege certain forms of violence, or seem to normalize certain forms of violence. And so we see masculinity as powerful, as dominant, as the appropriate aggressors, and as necessary. In order to be a man and to identify as a man, you have to have certain qualities which position you in a powerful space or in a position of power over and above certain genders. And so we recognize that these power relations seek to establish identity through that very act of overpowering. And so we find violence that happens to poor men by rich men, to gay men by straight men, to cisgendered men, to trans men from cisgendered men. And I use men here, I think, as a representation of the status quo as it stands, but also in way of troubling power dynamics, and saying that the very need and gravitating towards that power is a sense of assuming masculinity. It's wanting to assume a sense of dominance and want to assert oneself in such a way. And so this physical, verbal, mental power over seeks to participate and exclude, and to exclude other vulnerable groups in order to reassert itself over and above of those groups. And so men as perpetrators of violence are seen to be, in terms of stats, the greatest perpetrators against women, LGBTI people, elderly people, and children. in their various pockets of gender, and in relation to the ways in which their masculinity is seen, or the way masculinity is represented. And this is often than not a way to highlight their hegemony and the toxic forms of masculinity, which have been perpetuated through socialization, or conditioned through socialization, and passed down generation to generation. And seldom do people question the effects of this hegemony, because often than not it privileges people who assume it and positions them in spaces of power. And so the privilege and the power is such that one does not necessarily question what effects it has, but it enforces the very perpetuation and instilling of it in order to maintain itself. And so it is rooted within society's bone, society's fiber, in understanding men, and all genders are modeled after that. It's men on top, women, LGBTI people, children. And so trauma modeling resulting to monomalized absence in the family structure is due to how men, in a way in which they've understood masculinity, often not been able to cater to forms of nurturing, forms of presence in the family, in order to engage ways in which men can feel actualized and realized in society. And the absence of that causes a ripple effect within the family, where you find boys, young children growing up with certain ideals of masculinity and manhood, in which they emulate, not really questioning how those would adversely affect others. You find obviously pockets of people who do question these, but the fiber of society, in order to maintain itself, would seek to perpetuate and engage these forms. And this condition is to be seen as strong and powerful, and results in the ability to express or deal with emotions because of said condition. And so the ideal of men don't cry, men don't speak out, there's no such thing as a sensitive man, is an ideal that boys grow up with in society, to act strong and tough as providers, to perform certain ways of masculinity that then recondition them as grown adults who reinstill these forms of masculinity that do not re-engage the humanity, but seek to instill this robotic, inhumane way of expressing self. And so growing up under conditions also of violence and abuse, where violence is appropriated and no figure or figures or positive role models are there or present to ensure purpose and to model how men or boys should treat others, really makes men and boys grow up in spaces where they feel that they can be the custodians of this part of identity and instill these forms of violence and abuse to the next generation. And so we normalize violence in that way, in ways in which we sit within the hierarchy of gender, ways in which we perpetuate that hierarchy by informing what men, what a real man is in this toxic form. A real man is a protector, a real man is a provider, a real man is an aggressor, it keeps the family safe. Those types of talks finally position men in ways in which they can normalize forms of violence and forms of aggression in order to keep the family safe. And in that so doing, when people come out and speak against such forms of violence, we tend to victim blame and say that where were they in that space? Men are men, or boys will be boys, and so we can't really fault them for expressing themselves in certain ways. But the victim, what were you doing? How were you transgressing your gender? How were you refusing to normalize or appropriate your position in terms of your gender, ideal gender? And so that's why you position yourself in that space of abuse. And so the cycle of abuse in itself makes it very difficult for people to leave, where as a woman, you'll be expected to stay in relationships where you are abused, where if you're a child in family stead, and you report a matter to your parent, and your parent says, it's your uncle, it's your father, and you can't report that to an outsider. You must keep this safe into the family, and you are expected to serve them breakfast the next day. That makes it difficult for one to be able to speak out, difficult for one to be able to recognize this form of abuse as something that is inherently wrong within the structure of relationships and gender, particularly. And we then become complacent as victims of violence. And then society appropriates these things where it makes it okay for men to be men and for women to be subhuman, or for LGBTI people to be subhuman or subpar to that relation of men. And so we maintain the structure of society, the hegemonic, heteronormative structure of society. And so we live happily ever after as the nuclear family, without necessarily having to dissect or undo the ways in which these forms of normalizing activities or actions in gender cause harm to society. And these people are not psychopaths, as stats have said before, or strangers, but people who are normalizing ordinary behaviors that were taught that are okay, taught that should constitute what a person is, a real gendered person, whether they're a man or woman is. And so it's really hits quite close to home when these happen. And it's a way in which we stop boys from playing with toys, with dolls, or force them to play with guns instead. And so we groom them to grow into people of violence. And so we really need to open spaces where people can talk. Men can have spaces where they can engage, to normalize speaking out, to understand that mental health are ways in which they can recognize the humanity and connect to other people outside of the expected roles, and that these roles aren't the end all and be all, but ways in which our society has found ways to understand the sex disparities. But our gender is who we are, is who we learn to be, is who we're comfortable to being, and this grows. This grows differently as time goes by, as we express our emotions, as we understand who we are, as we express relationships, and we navigate our spaces in society. And then so our gender grows, our gender understands itself through those relations. And so ways in which we can support find networks of support for survivors is that we need to understand that the support is complex and sensitive. And we need to ensure that people who do experience violence receive urgent and immediate attention, and that both survivor and the person who will be hearing the report are both safe at that point. Listening and treating information confidential is quite an important part as well to the process, so that anyone involved is kept safe and away from harm, and inform survivors of options available to them. And this requires one to do their research. This also requires one to reach out to NGOs, to other resources, in order to understand what processes are available for people to follow when they find themselves as victims of gender-based violence. We need also to share accurate and up-to-date information on the services available in a particular area, and which changes depending on the available resources. We need to also, if context is needed, understand that a survivor must agree to who must be informed and what must happen next, which is informed consent. So they need to be to understand how the process works, and they need to consent and understand their role in that process. And then one needs to then follow those referral pathways as suggested. As people who are listeners in those spaces, we need to not counsel or force assistance, but inform ways in which help can be sought out, and that help does not need to be sought out now if one feels uncomfortable, but can also do that at a later stage. And we need to also, again, treat these details of the incident and the personal identifiers with utmost confidentiality. If someone approaches you, you must refer them to the processes that can assist the survivor and, again, to treat information as confidential. We've seen strides so far.
Apologies.
Yes, Loretta.
Sorry, I'm wondering if you could, I'm not sure how far away you are from the end, but whether you could kind of move towards wrapping up, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. These are some of the institutional shifts that we've had and some of the institutional shifts that we need to see. We need to find more actions in police stations that recognize gender diversity and have the proper commodities in place. We also need to diversify the ways in which we teach children about gender and gender discourse and their power within the spaces of speaking out and the equalities in genders. And where justice is needed, we need to understand where those legal assistance can be provided, where safe havens can be provided, and where justice can be sought out. To wrap up, we need to understand also new ways of understanding men, spaces of socializing. We start at the home, in churches and schools, at initiation schools, where we promote boys and girls as equal, and LGBTI people, transgender people, all people as equal, and no gender relations as power assertions over the other, and that find ways in which we can equalize the playing field in terms of power sharing within the economic and relation and racial aspect, as well as sexual aspect. And this also means diversifying sexual education, ways in which we channel emotions as well, is quite important, and calling out rape culture and catcalling as people who hear and engage the speak in our everyday. It starts with us as a community to speak out in order to stop this nip it in the bud and find ways in which we can find a safer system. And so reimagining gender is to be open to the idea that individual might not be heterosexual, is to introduce yourself with the pronouns instead of assuming people's pronouns, understanding that gender neutral bathrooms are a thing, and proposing those in your spaces of institution, not to assume anyone as cisgender or heterosexual, but to model conscious support of non-heterosexual and non-cisgender people. To be willing to have honest conversations about harmful ways in which we understand gender norms, and schools and public facilities to offer opportunities for LGBTI people to recognize themselves through posters, to education material, etc., and champion discourse and programs that show support for LGBTI community. Sorry for taking up much of the time, because I hope I didn't do an injustice to that, but thank you so much for the opportunity for it. Thank you all as well, and welcome questions and the thoughts at the end.
Thank you so much, Savuka, for your presentation. We do look forward to the discussion and engagement at the end.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Benita Moman. Is a senior lecturer and program manager at the Global Citizenship Program at the University of Cape Town. Benita has a DPhil in Feminist Geography from the University of California, Davis, and an MPhil in Women's and Gender Studies from the University of the Western Cape. Benita's worked at the Human Sciences Research Council and at Rape Crisis Cape Town, currently teaching on social justice, decoloniality, and gender-based violence, and critical and community-engaged research methodologies. Benita's researched and published on GBV, masculinities, intersectional identities, and feminist methodologies, and is interested in decolonial and feminist pedagogies, as well as thinking through African epistemologies and situated knowledge making. Benita's most recent publication is a co-edited collection with Nadia Sanger entitled Racism, Violence, Betrayals, and New Imaginaries, Feminist Voices, published by UKZN Press. Benita, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Florita. So I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. I'm just going to speak to, I think, the question that you asked us to think about and consider. So the one of refusing and unsettling everyday knowledges. And so just thank you to Savuka, who's already begun to do that in terms of or in relation to what I wanted to talk about as well, or what I'm going to talk about as well. So just to begin to sort of name it, and I'm not going to be defining gender-based violence, because I think actually my definitions of gender-based violence is that it is, patriarchy is gender-based violence, coloniality is gender-based violence. And I'll unpack that in terms of unsettling everyday knowledges. And so maybe to start, for me, there's about 4, or just in terms of this presentation, thinking about 4 or 5 different sort of knowledges that we need to unsettle. And the first and the obvious one, of course, is patriarchy and gender. And it's that everyday knowledge. I mean, I always think like, in some ways we failed because patriarchy and gender is still so normalized in how we understand the world and how we are and how we live in the world. And so sort of everyday practices of masculinities and femininities that Savuka was referring to now is still so taken for granted. And so we still have to be advocating for the same things that we were advocating for 25 years ago. So maybe a little bit of background. So I worked at Rape Crisis in the late 1990s. I worked at a place called the Negro Women's Support Center in the late 1990s. And so then already we were advocating for stuff like masculinity and emotion, femininity and agency, femininity and power. So in many ways, nothing has shifted with regards to those discourses, which is why it's still necessary to unsettle that sort of everyday knowledges. But I suppose added to that for me is about thinking about femininity and shame, which I think we speak less about, or femininity and morality, femininity and silence. We speak less about that, or masculinity and accountability. Or masculinity and shame and masculinity and guilt. We speak less about that. And I suppose in some of my own research, I've just completed a review of Tutuzela care centers and conducted research with survivors. And so again, some of those discourses of femininity and shame that still exist and becomes attached to experiences of violence and sexual and gender-based violence. And so it's undoing all of that. But of course, it's not only that, right? Femininity and shame is much broader than that. And so similarly, my work so I've done my doctoral research with sex offenders. And again, there you see sort of those everyday discourses of masculinity and shame, which becomes hard to lift out because there's all that other stuff around what it means to be a man, which Savuka was referring to. So patriarchy and gender remains a big one in terms of unsettling knowledges. And then the second one is heterosexuality. And of course, it's intersectional. So heteropatriarchy, heteropatriarchy is something that, of course, is again one of those everyday knowledges. And for me, again, it's about unpacking sort of heterosexuality as sort of these discourses of value. And particularly in terms of how it links to gender, right? And so femininity is valued in particular way, and particular femininities are valued. Similarly with masculinity. And so for me, these discourses of value is also about unpacking sort of this notion of heterosexual romance and heterosexual love. I mean, part of me thinks we need to stop talking about gender-based violence. Everybody knows what it is. It's been around for a long time. The media is there. There is lots and easy to find ways of understanding gender-based violence. But do we talk enough about romance? Do we talk enough about intimacy? Do we talk enough about love? Or do we just assume that we know what that is? And why are we not educating more about that? Why are we not unpacking that and not sort of normalizing that, right? Not only normalizing violence, but it's normalizing love in particular ways. So I think it's also it's those sort of discourses of value that we need to unpack. And then also, I suppose, discourses of desire. If you think of heterosexuality, you think of morality, what is sort of discourses that shape sort of femininities in terms of desire and in terms of morality. And so I'm just thinking of some of my notes. I was thinking, there's the discourses of desire around linked to sex and virginity. And these discourses of desire and value that there's a whole sort of, not a spectrum necessarily, but there's almost seem like a pathway in terms of how you're supposed to be in terms of a heterosexual or practicing of heterosexual femininities and heterosexual masculinities, and it needs to end in marriage and motherhood. And that's what becomes valued. So how do we unpack those discourses, which is very everyday, you know? And so there's Mother's Day, really, we're still celebrating that as a form of value of women, but it's not real in a sense, right? It's around a particular fiction of motherhood and what that means, or fatherhood and what that means. So it's unpacking those sort of discourses of value and sort of untangling those notions of reproduction and reproductive roles and value of femininities, procreation and roles of what that means for women and for men. So I think those discourses of value and desire, that's every day that we need to unpack. And then and maybe just linked to that was something that for me is, again, it's very problematic, but again, even through these kind of conversations, we're reinforcing it. So if I think of discourses of heterosexuality and think of desire and think of discourses of value and morality, this notion of teenage pregnancy and what's been in the media over the past 2 years around teenage pregnancy and girls under a particular age. And that's usually problematic, right? Because again, almost it's actually framing intimate partner violence through a teenage pregnancy lens, because it's linked to procreation and it's linked to value. And so if we unpack this notion of teenage pregnancy, I mean, there's always the sort of discourses of what we call damage, disease, and danger. And again, that's linked to discourses of value, femininity, and discourses of value in relation to masculinity. So we need to be unpacking that. We need to be responsible around responsible in the ways that we don't reinforce that, right? Or reify those beliefs and those taken for granted knowledges. And then the third sort of form of knowledge that I think we need to unpack is the idea of violence. And so we need to begin to unpack and separate what criminal violence from colonial violence. And colonial violence is not something that happened in the past. We need to think through colonial violence through the lens of coloniality. I think often we talk about gender-based violence only as criminal violence, but we don't go further. So we don't think of how criminal violence is conceptualized. And for me, it's conceptualized through Western epistemologies. And so gender-based violence becomes a crime, and it becomes either a direct form of violence or an indirect form of violence. And then there's a whole list of how to respond to that as direct violence or indirect violence. But actually, it's part of the epistemology that's framing gender-based violence only and always as criminal violence, and not problematizing criminal violence, right? So how is criminal violence constituted? And in terms of our constitution, criminal violence can also only ever be linked to notions of human rights. And so we need to unpack these everyday sort of discourses of violence and criminal violence, but we also need to unpack this notion of human rights. And the criminal justice system in many ways is limited to the Constitution, and the Constitution is very limiting. And so this notion of the human rights, which is embedded within the Constitution, is then the way with which we engage violence. And we cannot then step outside of, in very many ways, this ideas of very individualized forms of violence. And therefore we have to reduce gender-based violence to individualized form of violence, and it becomes an interpersonal form of violence. And so it becomes a one man who hits one woman. And that's the only way that we understand violence. And that's the only way it's criminalized. And that's the only way that it gets responded to, which is problematic, and it's going to see us sitting here in the same place in another 30 years. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, is that we also then need to unpack these taken for granted knowledges of human rights, because I think in many ways, it's doing more harm than good. And then I think lastly, for me, it's about unsettling and unpacking this notion of psychology and unsettling notions of popular psychology, right? And so if I think of increasingly sort of observing the way people speak about not only gender-based violence, but speak about, for example, some of the things that I teach, social justice, community engagement, those sort of, even just thinking about those concepts, it's often reduced to only thinking about people as individuals, and only thinking about violence as interpersonal and between individuals. And I think part of the problem is psychology, is that, it's this idea that people can only ever be psychological and that people cannot be sociological. And so for me, we have to unsettle that notion of popular psychology, that people are always only individuals, right? They're also sociological beings. And how do we introduce the sociology of people into sort of more, I suppose, ways of talking about, ways of thinking about gender-based violence. And so lastly, in terms of the question around where do the possibilities lie? So the possibilities lie, for me, it's about freedom, right? And so not about safety, it's not about response systems, it's about freedom. So where does women's freedom, what does women's freedom look like? What does freedom look like for queer and sexual minorities, for example? What does that freedom look like? Or for me, queer feminism is always very strong in terms of pointing us towards directions of freedom. And then collectivities and solidarities, that's a place of freedom, because one, it asks us to rethink of ourselves, or to rethink ourselves as individual, right? Or only psychological. It asks us to think of ourselves as sociological and communal. And so the idea of collectives and the idea of solidarities and building on notions of indigenous collectives, indigenous knowledges, indigenous ways of doing things, and the idea of consciousness raising between groups and between people. And so for me, both freedom and possibilities lie in the idea of collectives. And then maybe a little bit more controversially, it also lies in withdrawing from the criminal justice system, because the criminal justice system reinforces in some ways, like I said, criminal violence, which is very much based on this idea of human, and the idea of a Western notion of human. And so the criminal justice system has failed women. It's failed survivors of gender-based violence many times, and will continue to do so, because it's not in the interests to shift and to change that. In the interest of maybe one or two really harsh penalties, but what happens to the rest? What happens to the rest of the cases? Increasingly, we hear that, not only increasingly, but there's always the idea of we need more legislation. There's always more legislation. We have great sexual offences legislation, but yet 2 or 3 years ago, we needed more legislation. We need to amend the legislation around bail. And in 5 and 10 years' time, we're going to need more legislation. And so it's that sort of system that continues to reproduce itself. And so for me, it doesn't hold the answers, and it doesn't hold our freedom, and it doesn't hold justice. Many survivors sort of experience a sense of justice outside of the criminal justice, not inside of the criminal justice system. And so I think in many ways, we need to start withdrawing from a system that doesn't work for us. And then also thinking about idea of African epistemologies and what that then means for African philosophies of what it means to be human, and what it means to be human through ideas of connection, and as I was saying, building solidarities. So it's always also a both and rather than an either or approach, right? And so concepts such as gender, heterosexuality, we just need to get rid of it. It's that simple, but of course not that simple. But why do we need it? People have these notions of how to be a progressive man, a liberating man. Like, seriously, why do you actually need the concept of man? I always think, what are people actually proposing when they're talking about what's it, positive masculinities? What's positive masculinities? Men that need to be nurturing, men need to be this, we need to be kind, we need to be compassionate, but they're not, isn't that women? that femininity. So, you know, I think those sort of contradictions in terms of what we're advocating for. So I think gender and sexuality needs to go in the same way that we've advocated for a very long time, that race needs to go, that it's a fiction, so is gender and sexuality. It's fictions and it needs to go. So yeah, I've said a lot. I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, Floretta. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Benita. You've really given us a lot to think about and put a lot of provocative suggestions on the table that thank you so much for that. I think there's going to be a lot to talk about and I look forward to the conversation. I'm just reminding you all to please post your questions in the chat to the respective presenters. And I'm going to introduce our next panelist, Kaylin Palm. Kaylin is a versatile reporter with a decade of experience in the field. She cut her teeth as a cub writer for the community paper straight out of university. It's here she believes that she built invaluable skills and contacts while on the crime, investigative and community beat. It also laid a solid foundation for a leap towards an equally successful career in radio over the years. A former eyewitness news reporter, Kaylin knows well the dynamics of a fast-changing and demanding news cycle. Her knack is finding the story behind the story and the human behind the headlines. Nowhere is this more pertinent when covering an array of stories, including tales of gender-based violence. The hard-felt impact of the real crime statistics and the realities of the Cape's most marginalized and neglected families. Not just a talented wordsmith, Kaylin's also an acclaimed multimedia journalist. She may have hung up a radio mic for now, but her activism hasn't been silenced. It's taken on a new form in her role as gender-based violence coordinator and communications officer at civil rights organization Action Society. Welcome, Kaylin, and over to you.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you so much for that introduction as well. I've only been in this space for the past 2 months, going on 3 months. I've been a newspaper and radio journalist for about 10 years. And I think that what I've learned is basically from journalism, as well as over the past 2 months working as a coordinator at Action Society. So Action Society is a civil rights organization. We work in the area of Cape Town, specifically on the Cape Flats. And basically what we do is we support victims of gender-based violence, and obviously of people who have lost their loved ones or family members through gender-based violence. So Action Society has basically built a model, and in this model, we focus on the criminal justice aspect. And I know that Sivuka has quoted some shocking statistics when it comes to gender-based violence. We know that over the past 2 years, sexual offenses, rape, and any other violent crime has increased. We heard over the 3-month period in this year how gender-based violence has increased yet again. So as Action Society, we literally thought, you know what? We've been seeing this increases. We have lobbied, we have called on government to step up and obviously take some action. So we basically, what we do on a daily basis, we roll up our sleeves and literally just do it ourselves. So that's just basically in a nutshell what Action Society does. As the Action Center model, we do 3 things. We spend time with victims of gender-based violence, whether it be rape, a rape of a child, a rape of a woman, a rape of a man. We sit down with them, whether it be sometimes inside their homes, sometimes we take them on a beach ride, sometimes we sit at McDonald's, because sometimes we find that people do not want to speak up while the perpetrator is within their home. So we sit down with them, we listen to them, write down, do the interviewing bit, just to get a sense of what happened to them. And then secondly, we have in the action center model, like I said, we focus on the criminal justice system. What we'll do is we'll have a team that does investigative work. So we understand that there are many challenges within the space of SAPS. We know that they are struggling with their vehicles. There's a shortage of vehicles when it comes to various police stations, especially in marginalized areas. We understand that cops have approximately 250 dockets that they have to investigate. Can you picture one officer with 250 cases that he has to investigate? It's absolutely ridiculous. So what we do is, as an investigator, not myself, we have a team. What they do is they call the officer who is assigned, for example, to a rape case, and ask the officer, what is it that you need? What can we do? How can we assist you? So what they'll do is they'll be like, you know what, there's an outstanding statement that you can assist us with. We will do that. We then assist them, and the third part of the process is doing the watching brief. So we've spent time with them, we've identified what the issue is or how we can assist, and the third leg of it is doing watching briefs. So what we'll do is we'll take that victim, we will go with them to court at every court appearance, and we'll sit with them, and we will find out from the prosecutor or investigating officer if there's anything that they need. But at the same time, we are there to ensure that everything runs accordingly, because what we do is, what the reality is in South Africa is that dockets go missing, statements go missing. So we ensure that the process in that particular case runs smoothly. So that's the three things that we do as the Action Center. And just as an example, two of the cases that I'm going to speak to you about is ran this week and is obviously back on the court roll tomorrow. So for example, Nosipiwe James, I'm not sure whether you've heard of this case, but this girl, she lived in Khayelitsha. She and a boyfriend were at a tavern, and she was killed with a screwdriver in her neck. That happened. And then probably like 5-10 minutes later, a mass murder happened just literally down the road from where she was killed. So picture this, everybody running towards Nosipiwe James's body. And then 10 minutes later, they run into a mass murder where 6 people were killed. So literally Nosipiwe James was forgotten, and Becky Clearly and his crew obviously came down to Khayelitsha and spoke about that mass murder, forgetting about Nosipiwe James, who was killed brutally as well. So what we did was we literally contacted the family, spoke to the family, asked them how we could assist them. The family indicated that the suspect has literally fled to the Eastern Cape following the alleged murder. We then contacted the Eastern Cape police, contacted Cape Town police in Khayelitsha, and asked them whether we could assist. We then gave the location. We gave the location as to where this man was, and literally he was brought back within at least less than a week, and he's obviously in court now for the 3rd time. So that's just an example as to what we do. And every week since he has appeared, we have been with the family, we have been with the friends of Nosipiwe James, just to ensure that everything runs accordingly, so that hopefully at some point they'll get justice. Another incident that had happened that we picked up last week, 2 minors were raped by their grandfather. One was aged 4 years old, the other was aged 10. And what we are doing is we are also walking that journey with that family in order to ensure justice. So that's basically what we do. So another question has been asked, what can we do to build a more safer or build a society where violent crime doesn't happen? So for us, it's super simple. So we've built this model basically because we feel that government is not doing enough, even though they are supposed to be doing something, or even if they are doing something, it's at a very, very slow pace. So basically, we think that there should be more police resources in areas where it's needed the most. What we do is, obviously, like I've said, we focus on the criminal justice aspect, but what we try and do is we try and assist when it comes to the preventative measures as well. So we think that if we make areas safer, then obviously women and children can walk around freely and they can feel safe. So what we try and do is we try and capacitate neighborhood watches and community policing forums, in that we assist them with training, with DNA training, crowd control training, as well as how exactly do you identify certain hotspots in your area when it comes to crime analysis. So I'm not a pro in that. My colleague, Ian Cameron, he's a pro in that. So what he will do is he will sit with the neighborhood watches and they'll sort of build like build an app or build sketch a scenario as to how do you identify hotspots in certain areas when it comes to gang violence. So they do that. So we try and do training on that as well. But we also do self-defense courses with mostly women. Men do attend, but mostly women attend. And that's obviously just to try and defend themselves if and when they find themselves in a situation that is obviously unsafe. So that's the three things that we do: the training, the watching briefs, assisting, reaching our hand out to police to help assist them. And basically from government side, we know that there are challenges, but we hope that Becky Kelly and SAP's management do plow more resources into policemen, so that they can ultimately make our streets, our society safer. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Kaylin, and kind of recounting your experiences of also what it means to sit alongside and work closely to support survivors of gender-based violence. So thank you for that. A reminder to you in the audience to please post your questions in the Q&A. And then last but not least, I want to introduce our final panelist. Tarisai Mchuchu McMillan is an African feminist, advocate, and crime and violence prevention specialist focused on violence against women and violence against children. Tarisai is currently Executive Director of Mosaic Training Services and Healing Center for Women, an NPO that advocates for preventative laws and policies to be advanced to effectively reduce gender-based violence, in particular domestic, sexual, and intimate partner violence. Tarisai designed the SAFE PR program currently piloted by Mosaic, which is the main subject of the chapter of what she's written about. The SAFE PR project is focused on ensuring that women's rights to safety in relationships, homes, and communities is advanced by strengthening duty bearers and first responders who make up the security, justice, and psychosocial support services system in response to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Mosaic coordinates localized multi-stakeholder platforms made up of first responders to domestic violence and intimate partner violence in communities and works with them to increase capacity to respond through a gender transformative lens by building relationships amongst local multi-stakeholder frontline responders in a coordinated manner that enables better service responses for victims of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, ensuring that protection orders protect and that further harm is prevented. Tarisai completed her BA in 2006 and LLB in 2010, degrees at the University of Cape Town, and is an advocate of the High Court of South Africa. Over to you, Tarisai.
Thank you, Floretta. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. All right. All right. I'm going to start my video just so that maybe people can see. I don't know if you can see, but it's a little bit chaotic. So I'm going to just say hi, and then I'm going to put it off because all my babies are around me, and thanks to load shedding, we've got one light. So we have to, they don't want to be somewhere else, and I can't move the light to the office. So we're just going to be together. So I hope you can bear with me with the background noise, but I guess this is the real prevention of violence going on right now in my house. All right. Thank you for this opportunity. And it started already. Okay. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Mosaic and who we are and the organization I represent, and then we'll delve into the subject of the matter. Mosaic is a community-based organization. We're a non-governmental organization founded in '93. We're based in Cape Town, but present in Western Cape as a province, KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. We work to prevent and reduce abuse and domestic violence, focused particularly by providing holistic, integrated services for healing and empowerment of women and children. We do this through support services, access to justice, and gender transformative rights training for the advancement of safety in relationships, homes, and communities. We've got a 5-pillar program linked to this, a particular access to justice. We provide court support services, and we run 3 Tutuzela care centers in the Western Cape, Khayelitsha, Atlantis, and Worcester. We have a long-term, medium-term, and short-term counseling support services depending on the needs of the survivor, and we run 2 shelters in the rural areas. We've got a link to this. We have an empowerment program in which, of course, many of our survivors stay in abusive relationships because of access or lack of access to finances. So we try to bridge this gap by ensuring that they have access to skills, education, and training, either by providing it directly. So we've got a kitchen, we've got a sewing project, or ensuring that, because not everyone wants to sew, cook. As a career, so for those, we make sure that there are linkages to other partners or educational institutions to upskill the survivors. We've got a particular focus around engaging men and boys, around sensitization and transformative workshops and training. And we have a designed counseling for men program to ensure prevention of violence against women. So this one is really around supporting women survivors when they are not exiting the relationship, and ensure that they support on both sides. So our counselors provide that family counseling as well. We've got, of course, our big program is linking all this in practice to ensure that we're advancing policy and law so that there's effective protection for women. And we'll talk about the law and how useless or useful it is in this aspect as I go along. We've already heard some of it, so I will be repeating some of the notions here. So to answer the question, what are the everyday knowledges and practices that we need to refuse and unsettle towards a provoking change towards freedom? Particularly, I wanted to highlight the paradoxical tension of facts versus reality. And facts here, it's what I'm terming facts in terms of what is researched, what is reported, what is highlighted in paper. That's what I'm considering as facts, because that often basically puts our mind or in focus to how big the issue is, right? When we read about it, it's reality. When we read about it, it's factual. So for instance, statistics is one of those facts that we see. We see it on paper, 10,000 women were raped, 2,050 women were, experienced GBV common assault. That's the stats. And then we take that as fact. And of course, it kind of paints the picture of how big the issue is or not. Okay. And then, of course, the numbers. For instance, already, Floretta already mentioned the Femicide Reports that SMARC produced. Some of us in practice who are not academics, we can, look at that and go like, how's that possible? Because in my work, I'm experiencing this, or the lived reality that I'm dealing with is this, but the report is showing this. And again, that can cause tension, or that can also even influence the way funds to issues around prevention and response to violence against women goes into the way that government prioritizes, or the way that we as practitioners even understand the issue. Does it skew the way we view things? So again, we need to unpack that and see where's that coming from and how do we place it in practice. Again, another thing that also I then look at, particularly in relation to these numbers. So who is in the report, right? Which women are we counting when we're talking about the stats or these numbers? Who is reporting and how are they reporting? Who was counted? For me, I think that's a very important question that we have to consider and grapple around when we talk about, particularly from a practitioner's perspective. Okay. And then lastly, I really want to highlight is the lived reality. Is the fact that what's not written is equally important to what's written and what we're seeing. We know that women live in perpetual fear of actual violence or threatened violence. How is that translating to these numbers and these research reports that we grapple with in order for us to really understand and start solving the issue? So those are things that I think we need to both receive but push against and constantly question so that we're able to really get to the point where we solve the problems we're having. So things that we have experienced, and I'm linking particularly what we've embodied or what we've seen in practice, was that 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And this particular, so their high chances of injury or death. It does not necessarily translate into the numbers we see in reports, because we know that there are many that are not reporting. We know that there are barriers to reporting. We know that also, even, and I'm not a researcher, so this is for the researchers, Floretta and colleagues, research also uses sampling. So what happens to those that are not sampled? It's something that I always, like, from practice, we need to always question, and how do we start to ensure that, because we believe the issue is big, so how do we get to the root cause without excluding these experiences? And this is where we have to start linking that lived reality. We know that gender inequality, male dominance, promotion of masculinities based on violence and control is rife. Children in households where mother is abused are more likely to experience violent discipline from both mother and father, aunt or uncle, grandmother, grandfather, whatever the relationship is, whichever adult is present in their life. We also know that there are lack of responsive institutions. And then there are weak legal sanctions against violence against women and violence against children. So all of this combined, what does that mean for us, right? So there's an article that actually was just published a few days ago by Matodzi Amisi and colleagues, and it's talking about the crisis of gender-based violence, and that if we report and continuously look at gender-based violence, particular violence against women, as a crisis, then we're always patching. It's almost like you have a wound that you just, because you see it bleeding, so you put a plaster. You see it bleeding, so you go to the doctor, or you get a pain, or you feel pain, then you go to the doctor. But you're not actually solving, because you constantly are in knee-jerk mode, instead of actually dealing with it as the reality, as the situation as it is as a whole. So for instance, part of this, made me realize, just hold on. Part of it is really, we need to look at violence against women in South Africa is not only in numbers, although very important, right? But it is also in the nature of violence and how extreme this violence is. And the fact that it's a daily occurrence of violence against women, and that there is an acceptability of this violence against women, especially when it comes to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And we're going to unpack this a little bit more now. So I want to look at it specifically when we talk about the COVID-19 crisis. For me, that's the crisis. COVID-19 presented an unprecedented crisis for domestic violence services because of the rapid nature to which we had to adapt, right? So we saw women, we saw victims, people were already victimized, or people that were at the brink of being victimized, and we know that there were new dangers that were presented because of the crisis. So what does that mean when you isolate? Victim help seeking drops. So all our services were designed for people coming to us to receive our services, but now that was cut off. There was no way for them to get to us to report. How do we then get to them? So that was one key thing. And then we know what the consequence of that is, that you've got DV increasing. In-person service interaction, so Mosaic services and counseling workshops were all designed to be in person, and our staff were trained to render the services in person. What does that mean for the survivor and the victim in lockdown, when we were not prepared to even respond to their lived reality as well? So this is something, and I know I'm speaking to educators and students, particularly psychology students, and we need to think about those things around training. How are we preparing if crisis like that would come again? And again, ensuring that we're investing particularly in staff and staff wellness. They were also scared, our frontline service practitioners and other practitioners who are not necessarily from Mosaic, scared for their own health. But we are now, from a feminist perspective, we're expecting them to also still render services. How does that look like an impact, particularly in terms of ensuring that we're still responding to these lived realities? And of course, we've got funding, right? Funding and ensuring that this work continues is all donor contracts, target driven, but not necessarily linked to. And we learned quickly that this was not linked to actually the lived realities of the crisis that women were, and had to work to adapt those things. So those are things that we constantly have to grapple with in our work as well, when we're looking at how do we ensure that we are responding adequately to this, to the issue of domestic violence in an ongoing. So in terms of domestic violence, and I want to link it, is what we knew already about domestic violence. It's a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors, and Savuka highlighted that all the complexities around power and control very beautiful. If people used to control their intimate partner,
Teresa,
I moved. Hello.
I think we're losing you. The connection sounds, you weren't quite audible there for a moment.
Okay. Am I back?
You are back, yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So women being the most affected. So either this situation made it worse for men who lived with this already, or created new problems for others. So now, what we need to look at is really the position of women, from Mosaic side, we're women's organization, women's rights organization. So we look at it from all perspectives, that the default pattern on patriarchy and patriarchal norms makes women unsafe in relationships, homes, and communities. And what and where are the possibilities for building a nonviolent future? So For instance, one of the things that we as Mosaic are really working on is to determine how we respond in terms of this. So the first is really, it's a systemic solution because the violence already exists and there needs to be urgent and immediate and sustained solutions to ensure that those experiencing the violence are protected. So the law and those that are mandated to implement the law. So on one end is the existence of the law itself on paper, that's important. The rule of law is important, but it needs to go a step further to ensure that it's being implemented. And we know that we have it on paper, but it's not being implemented. And we're going to talk about some of the ways in which we're working towards that. The second thing is, and equally to balance that, is gender transformative processes, women being valued and respected as human beings. It's something we have not seen. It's not being done yet. We actually see, I mean, if we see what's happening even in the global north, right, with Roe v. Wade, when it hits the fan, what happens? We start trampling and compromising with women's rights. And even when we talk about human rights in South African Constitution, every single leg talks of human rights in the Constitution, yet women constantly have to fight for their rights. We just heard a few weeks ago with the Women's Legal Center, they just achieved recently equality in marriage for Muslim women to be able to dissolve marriages. They couldn't do that, you know, so those rights, you know, we constantly have to see how patriarchy continuously shows in law in disenfranchising women. So what we are looking at is systemic protection, creating a safer and more responsive system that women can rely on to be safe, but also focusing on women's rights in all spaces, gender transformative education of all in the community that foster gender equality and empower survivors to stand up, report, and speak up. So what we're doing is we've launched what we call the SAFE program, is looking at a coordinated response, right? Ensuring that survivors access protection orders. So ensuring that there is a connectivity in police, DSD, NPA, CBOs, or what we call frontline, the courts and community forums, that there's no siloed working. And how we are doing that, we've created what we call the SAFE platforms, which are localized stakeholder collaborators focused on building relationships at a local level. So if I live, so we are piloting in Philippi, Mitchell's Plain, and Paarl currently. That means there's a Paarl Safe platform in which there's a deliberate, coordinated effort with all these duty bearers and first responders at a community level to ensure that there's relationship building, where we are building personal, professional, institutional level relationship, but focused on that, we then look at gaps in knowledge and training, build that up, making sure there's a victim-centered approach so that there is trustworthy. I, as a survivor, can be guaranteed. Sorry, my toddler is not having it anymore. I'm just going to pause quickly. Okay,
that's fine, Tarisa.
Okay, we've put him in control of the device. Okay. I might have to.
No, it's fine, Tarisa. It's fine. You if you're able to come back when we're wrapping up, or it's
okay.
yeah.
I think we've calmed him down. I'm just going to finalize quickly, Floretta, if that's okay.
Sure, yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay, so just to move along, I wanted to highlight this quickly, particularly around psychologists and social workers, because I know I'm speaking to educators who educate psychologists and social workers and those that are studying for it. Particularly, we are looking for you to be prepared for the field. So not part of the system is not that we are looking at just police officers, it's a them problem, it's an us problem. Because we are having psychologists and social workers who are not prepared for the field. And the bulk of the response work with domestic violence survivors lies with the healing and doing no harm and being victim-centered approach that lies with psychologists and social workers. I, as a lawyer, can do so much for healing in terms of just getting access to justice, but I mean nothing to a survivor. And where we are having ill-prepared psychologists and social workers is where we need to move part of this to ensure that we are, that rights-based approach that we're talking about can really be entrenched. So for instance, you understand that you're training people to work with people. That is important, even if you're going to end up only writing papers as a researcher. You still interview people, and I think that's quite important. Money talks, we know, but and is for those that end up in private practice, we are having a lot of harmful reports that are detrimental to survivors being produced by psychologists and social workers. And because you are the expert in the room providing this basis, particularly where women are disenfranchised in terms of post-violence, post-separation violence, so you can get the protection order against your perpetrator. But if you share children with each other, you need to know that there's now going to be another battle around access to those children, around maintenance. And where psychologists and social workers are bringing detrimental reports where they disregard survivor experiences and looking at who's paying the bills is becoming a big issue. And we need to start thinking of feminist ways and feminist approaches to justice, where we are not saying disenfranchised fathers in the process, but we are saying we need to have a do no harm approach, where it takes that violence that just because you have access to your children, you might be non-violent to the child, but they use the child to access and to further use power and control over the survivor. So that's something that to keep in mind. Your basket of tools, domestic violence is complex. It's not a textbook issue. So how are you going to ensure that you bolster your knowledge, right? Practice-based. And maybe this is where we need to encourage institutions to build in practice-based internships while studying. That's quite important. And again, linked to money, support those psychologists and social workers to be able to be placed in organizations so that they're able to get this practice-based knowledge. That's linked to institutional support and practice-based research. I want to move. So just in terms of the next thing, around, we want to talk about violence prevention. So the Violence Prevention Forum has created a definition around violence prevention is the whole of society working deliberately and sustainably to remove sources of harm and inequality and heal woundedness by intentionally growing an ethic of mutual care, respect, and inclusion to build peace. So when we're thinking of a violence-free future, I think we need to start thinking of violent prevention in this way. First, it's a whole of society approach, but we need to be thinking about how do we remove these sources of harm and inequality and heal woundedness, in growing an ethic of mutual care and respect and inclusion to build peace, right? So some of the strategies that I want to highlight, particularly around violence prevention, is in relationships, we share the care. We need to be able to call out sexism and harassment in all spaces. In gender transformative education for all. And I want to highlight this particularly because even for us, I'm highlighting specifically because we're a women's rights organization, but Savuka has really explained gender dynamics, place in which how we need to start being thinking in a non-binary way, right? So there's education there, there's transformation even from an organizational perspective in which we need to start thinking around homosexual relationships and how domestic violence manifests in those relationships. But we also need to realize that gender transformative education for all also has to translate in who are the NGOs educating when we do gender transformative work. It's the unemployed people who are in the townships, who have the time during the day to attend our workshops. However, if you look at the stats that are reported, but even our own clients and their experiences of violence, they're perpetrated by employed people who are employed by companies or who are attending educational institutions. So this means that we need to be creating spaces within all institutions where all of these designed models, be it from gender dynamics, be it from mosaic, be it from rape crisis, wherever it is coming from, we need to be able to still get these organizations to come and do these trainings where people are spending most of their time, which is in educational institutions and workplace institutions. And I put roses here because, you know, if any of you can Google this poem, I Got Flowers Today, and the poem ends with femicide, basically. The person says, I got flowers today, but they were on my grave, you know, and all of that. And it talks about the cycle of abuse. And it's really looking at equality in relationships, because when we're talking about violence in relationships, homes, and communities, I think we have to be thinking about what sort of flowers do we want. It can look like this little Valentine's graphic that I've got, but we know that relationships are this complex, and we need to be preparing each other, and particularly young people, of how complex relationships are in order for them to pursue healthy relationship, whatever it is, in whatever form they are comfortable with, and whatever they identify as. It has to be a healthy relationship in order for it to be non-violent. Because what I talked about the system and all of that, that's all responsive. But we need to be focusing on prevention. And the way we prevent is looking at that inward aspect of the relationship in the home. And then the outward part is how we respond as a community. Thank you very much. And thank you for your patience with all that's going on here. Floretta, you're muted.
Apologies. I was saying thank you, Tarisai, for navigating everything at home, load shedding, and thanks to your little one also for sharing you with us during this time. We have some time for questions and engagement, but let me just say, I think I picked up on just a few. There were a number, there were quite a few more, but a few kind of cross-cutting themes from our four panelists, the conversation from our four panelists. And the one is the question of violence as performances of power. Savuka spoke about masculine power, and also ideologies of power, right? Cis normativity, heteronormativity, and patriarchy. Then there was the question of everyday practices and how sometimes violence, particular forms of violence, gets marked out as, you know, outrageous, unusual, particularly media reports. But part of what scholars have written about, it's about how those everyday practices enable those more horrific forms of violence. And so what a number of our panelists have picked up on is this question of the everyday practices that we need to, and the lived realities around, you know, how we live, experience, and express our genders and sexualities, and how do we begin to unsettle what has been considered normative. Another theme, I think, is the question of what survivor, what justice for survivors can look like, whether that's inside or outside of the criminal justice system. You know, what does a victim-centered, survivor-centered approach look like? What are feminist forms of justice, for example, as Tarisai just indicated? And then I think there was also more kind of radical, I guess, provocation to all of us about how to unsettle, to disrupt, to do away with, not just maybe reimagine, but to demolish, in a sense, particular kinds of constructs, especially around gender. And for me in particular, you know, Benita's provocation that we need to actually stop talking about gender-based violence, that everyone knows what it is, and are there alternative ways for us to get at unsettling, reimagining, by putting other kinds of questions and issues on the table. So I'm gonna raise some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A and give our presenters an opportunity to respond. I think I'll start with the ones directed to particular people. Savuka, so I think I'm going to ask each one of you a question. Savuka, there was a question to please explain and elaborate on the privileges, cisnormativity, on cisnormativity and how that could be a factor in GBV. And then Benita, there was a question on what you mean by differentiating between colonial and criminal violence. Tarisai, how do you expect psychologists, and Tarisai, we also have psychologists in the room. I see you busy typing an answer, maybe you'll respond to that. But the question is, support, how can psychologists support the work that you're doing? Yeah, and it's the question about the detrimental report that you raised. Yeah. So maybe I'll give you, Savuka, Benita, and Tarisai an opportunity to respond to those questions. Savuka?
Hi everyone, thanks for those questions. So I think with cisnormativity, we can look at it as various roles and ideals ascribed to men and women, which men and women would need to prescribe to in order to fit in. This is done from birth. You know, you're told how to sit, how to talk, who to play with, how to present yourself. And this positions you in spaces where you are, on one, not marginalized, but two, recognized and assured, given a particular marker in a society, whether that be a woman who manages to retain their virginity till a particular age in Zulu culture, a woman who is married in a particular culture, in traditional cultures, who then assumes particular responsibilities and privileges, enjoys particular rights to land in particular cultures. In society, as a woman walking at night, presenting as a woman, of course, you know, in how we see gender now, it seems like patriarch would still frown upon women regardless of how they look. But let's say a trans woman who presents as a trans woman and who doesn't pass would often find more stigma and more ostracization, prone to violence, perhaps, in detrimental ways. And I mean, this is not in a way comparing how cis women find ways in which navigating their spaces might be quite dangerous for them, as opposed to trans women, but just to highlight that in various ways, having a kind of cisnormative identity makes you pass in certain spaces and gain certain respectabilities in particular spaces, as opposed to maybe a trans woman or trans man in particular spaces. And I mean, trans men who pass do enjoy particular privileges as well, as opposed to gay men who are effeminate, for example. And so as a trans person who can pass, you do enjoy certain privileges in cisnormativity. If you identify as trans, you might be more prone to violence. But as a cis person who does not necessarily adhere to all cisnormative ways of which you can express yourself or identify, you also face certain victimizations and are excluded to certain privileges as well. I'm not sure if that answers your questions, but I'm so open to responding to further queries there.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Savuka. And Benita, over to you.
Hi, Florita. I'm not going to put on my camera because the lights just went out. So load shedding is happening here where I am. So to distinguish between colonial violence and criminal violence. So colonial violence in many ways is thinking about knowledge and thinking about being and thinking about power. And so colonial violence in many ways has destroyed like indigenous knowledge systems. So we talk about epistemicide, right? So sort of the killing of indigenous knowledges. And so that is a form of violence, right? As well as, I suppose, the idea of being and being in power. And so my question around who constitutes the human? Who is the human embedded in human rights that we advocate for? Because we see that mostly middle-class people benefit from the Constitution and from human rights legislation. So what does that mean for poor working-class people? Are they not human enough to benefit from the human rights legislation? And so that for me is also a form of colonial violence. And so colonial violence includes sort of, like I say, spoke about in terms of knowledges, but also what we refer to, and I think Lorita referred to this earlier, what's termed symbolic violence or ideological violence. Whereas criminal violence often is defined through Western epistemologies and Western ideas of what constitutes crime and what constitutes violence. And so criminal violence, the way we engage with it, is embedded within the law. And South African law is largely based on Roman Dutch law. I mean, I don't have to tell you that Roman Dutch is not African. Roman Dutch is European. So it's European law, right? And so criminal violence is then constituted through already a colonial form of violence. Criminal violence then becomes reduced to what is defined as a crime. So it's a crime to hit somebody, that's then criminal violence. It's a crime to sexually assault somebody, that's then criminal violence. So criminal violence doesn't often speak to symbolic violence and ideological violence, whereas colonial violence does. Similarly, criminal violence doesn't speak to structural violence. It often speaks to very, very much sort of interpersonal violence more than anything else. So yeah, so that for me is the differences between colonial violence and criminal violence.
Thanks so much, Benita. Tarisai, are you able to answer the question live? Or?
Yes, I can. Yes,
please go ahead.
Okay, so the first thing is how can psychologists support us? One, you can always support us. Anyone can support us. We need all the help we can get. My details were at the end of the presentation, which I will share the presentation with Floretta, and please do contact us. There is free help we take. Sometimes there are opportunities that we can pay for, you know, so it all depends. So if you are keen on working around domestic violence, please do make contact. And all of, so that's the first part. The second part is how can, oh my goodness, comment there, shenanigans here. How can a report be detrimental? Okay, so like I mentioned in my presentation, particularly is I was really thinking of psychologists and social workers who are in private practice, who are writing private reports, particularly because you see, so if you work for Mosaic or another NPO, I apologize, there's a noise.
It's fine, Tarisa, it's not too much about it. Yeah.
All right, okay. So for those that represent, you know, so perpetrators who access their services and go like, I need a report to support me because I've got a case. And then they do not take, and sometimes they even interview both parties. And I'm not a psychologist, so probably, you know, there are other experts who say there's no objectivity in psychology, maybe that's that. But what we are asking is you do not make up facts. And I saw there's another question below where it's talking about a psychologist who then went, and regardless of what they, you know, they'd been treating someone for depression and then went in court and then, you know, lied about the victim's state or whatever, you know, and that's what we're experiencing in reports. So what do magistrates, because magistrates are lawyers like me, right? So what do they do when they have an expert witness or an expert report that's coming from a psychologist or social worker is they take your report as it is. And victims, particularly women who do not have access to income, cannot challenge your report. So you as an expert, you actually have an obligation to court to be survivor-centric and doing no harm with your report. Because while I understand that you are getting paid, I also understand that you also have a professional ethical mandate, that you present whatever you're presenting in an objective manner in what you have assessed and not what is in favor just because you want to favor the person paying you. That's what, it's the same as the law, right? The law is I'm an officer of the court. That's the first mandate I have. My oath is to speak truth. Somebody might be paying me, but if I find out that they are lying and all of that, I have an obligation to disclose that and not lie to the court. I think it's the same principle that we're asking of psychologists and social workers. And I think that needs to come through, whether it's in education preparation, in training, and in practice, because we're seeing a big difference there.
Thank you, Teresa. Kaylin, I want to check if there's any of the questions that you'd like to respond to in particular.
I've answered. I think someone has asked if we are based in Cape Town or in other parts of the country. It's a pilot project that we have started last year, November, in Cape Town, and we are hoping to expand in Gauteng sometime this year. Okay. But the other campaigns we are running countrywide. So if the is anyone that would like to assist in any sort of way, they can obviously reach out to us. We will appreciate that.
Thank you, Kaylin. Kaylin, I was just wondering about, I understand that, so maybe just a quick question from me, if you will permit. That you've spoken mainly about your role with Action Society and the work you do to support survivors through, through engaging with criminal justice. But you also have a long history of, as a media practitioner, who's, focused largely also on gender-based violence. And I wondered, there've been quite there've been critiques about media reporting, I guess, on gender-based violence and femicide. But if you have any kind of comments around, or just reflections around, your role, given the distance you have from it now, as a practitioner in relation to GBV.
For sure. So as the media, as a journalist and many other journalists that are covering gender-based violence, we cover crime and community safety because it's there. It's the reality that people live in. So we cannot ignore what's happening on the ground. Hence, the media has a huge focus on gender-based violence. We know that about 2 years ago, there was a massive march to Cape Town. And I remember the president being there as well, following the death of Unenene, a UCT student. And I think from that time, there was a huge focus on gender-based violence, and obviously the media had focused on that. So yeah, so I think that's why it is important for the media to cover gender-based violence, and we obviously encourage organizations to reach out to the media to tell us about what they're doing, so that we can obviously, when I was in the media, hold government accountable, because we know that government comes in and out saying that they will promise this, they will promise that, but in reality, it's actually not happening. So as a journalist, I've obviously covered these stories, and I was able to tell people stories, and that's what I enjoyed. But obviously moving over to the communications side, I'm able to tell the story, but also I'm able to do something. I think that's the major difference, in that I can physically do something now, just to help at least one victim at a time. If it answers the question.
Thank you. Yes, it does answer my question. And actually, it's a nice kind of reflection, wrapping up reflection. So I want to just very quickly give each panelist an opportunity to just say, in less than 1 minute, just a kind of quick closing reflection, maybe starting with Savuka, Benita, Tarisai, and then Kaylin.
Thank you. Thanks again for the presentation. I think it's quite important that we find ways to consolidate the conversation today about power being the ultimate form of oppression in its many ways, ways it presents itself, its guises, whether through gender identities, whether through economic influence, colonization, epistemic power. And so history also teaches us who possesses these parts of power, or these types of power, and how these have informed the ways in which we relate to each other, in which we progress in terms of engaging with one another. And so troubling these is quite important, and our roles in accepting such norms is important, but also being able to be vigilant enough to problematize and to question how these continue the ways in which we see relations and the ways in which violence has now become normalized based on these identities. And so understanding that, for example, men being men is a personality, is an identity, but how this construct has come to present something that has divorced itself from humanity. And from feeling and from being, and isolated itself from relating with others in a way that has promoted oppression and promoted violence in the way in which we see it today. And so just troubling those and speaking to that, speaking to ways in which we can challenge and see things differently, engaging these concepts differently, engaging ourselves differently, I think would be worthwhile. I think I also have quite a lot of things I learned in the session, and we need to come back and kind of revisit in ways in which I can then foresee how I further engage. But I think that for me is a take home in how we can continuously problematize our standpoint in relation to privilege, in relation to power, and how we can inform the conversation going forward. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Savuka. Over to Benita.
Thanks, Florita. So 2 things. 1, we need to be talking about love a lot more, gendered and sexualized love. And 2, we need to be talking about violence beyond criminal violence a lot more. So symbolic violence, ideological violence, colonial violence, and how that is sort of normalized and practiced in the everyday. So for me, those are the 2 big ones: love and violence beyond criminal violence.
Thank you so much, Benita. Unfortunately, Tarisai had to leave to attend to her little one. So Kaylin, I just wonder if you have any final thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, we've obviously noticed that gender-based violence is a complex matter. And I just feel that we hear the stats, we see the stats, we hear the stories, but I think that as a society, we need to work together. I think community organizations need to work together. So civil organizations need to work together, and as well as government. And if we all hold hands and work together, we can beat this thing called gender-based violence.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. A positive note to end on. So all that's left for me to do is to say a big word of thanks on behalf of SAISA to our panelists today who are navigating multiple load shedding challenges, also caretaking responsibilities. It's been wonderful to have you join us. We appreciate your energies and the time you took to be with us this evening. Thank you to everyone in the audience who joined this really important conversation. Please look out for our next webinar, our 4th and final one for 2022 in the series, due to be in September. And we also look forward to seeing you all at our Congress in October, and do look out for our program that will be released soon. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening further.